Hi. Wow. What an exciting evening we have ahead of us. I'm really thrilled that you could be here and join us for this evening of art, storytelling, and social activism. I wanted to tell you, well, first let me introduce myself. I'm Bernice Steinhardt. I'm the daughter of Esther Nisenthal Krinitz, whose art I hope you've seen on display in the museum, and whose art and story are really the inspiration for the program that we're presenting this evening. The art that my mother created was her way of sharing with us her life story and the visual images of her life story. After she finished creating each of those pictures, which she did just for me and my sister, Helene McQuaid, she gave them to me and I had them in my house until finally, first of all, I ran out of wall space, but also I realized that they needed to be out in the world. They needed to be seen by the world, really. And so Helene and I, 2 years after our mother died, Helene and I created our nonprofit organization, Art and Remembrance. And we, of course, wanted to be able to exhibit the artwork, but we also wanted to be able to use the artwork to inspire and to educate, and in particular, to have people understand what it's like to experience war from the point of view of those who are its innocent victims and who are the victims of oppression, terror, anti-Semitism, racism, and to be able to share those experiences with others so they can not only know about them, but also feel what it's like for those who experience them. So this is, in part, what the program tonight is about. It's about how art and personal experience of social injustice can be transformed into art in a way that people can really understand. We're going to begin, well, actually, let me first acknowledge a couple of people in the room. The staff of this museum are fantastic. I want to acknowledge in particular Becca Plum. I also, yes. I also want to acknowledge the person who in many ways is responsible for our being here, and that is our beloved Rebecca Hofberger. Yes. So once again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Now let me turn to the program for this evening. 2 parts. The first part is from storytellers, Stoop storytellers. You know, that is a hard phrase to say. And I commend Jessica and Aaron Henkin, who have to say it all the time. And they are going to tell you a little bit more about Stoop storytellers, and they're going to introduce this evening's 3 Stoop storytellers.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I'm Jessica Henkin, and this is Aaron Henkin, and this is our way of going out on a date together. Yeah. Hey.
It's the only excuse we have to get away from the children, really.
It's sad, but true. So we have had the honor to feature true personal stories from people in Baltimore for the last 18 years. Many of you who are in the audience tonight have shared stories, and it's just every time we get to do this, we feel incredibly grateful to be in a city that has just so many interesting, fascinating people. So the way that this works is very simple. We were asked to be a part of Esther's incredible, a celebration of Esther's incredible work by working with the American Visionary Art Museum to create a theme for the night. And then we basically went out to the community and asked folks if they had a true personal story on the theme. So art as a tool for social justice, creating art, creating change is the theme. And we have 3 folks who are going to be sharing true personal stories on that theme. And without further ado, I'll let you introduce our first storyteller.
All right, I'll do that. Thank you. Hey, I should say also, the Stoop has a pretty good podcast, too. Props to Daniel, the guy behind the camera back there, recording this for posterity. He's going to share the audio with us, so we didn't have to set up our big microphone in front of the stage. But we record all the Stoop events, and the stories then live for posterity on the storytelling.com website, and also on podcast as well. So
On WYPR.
A WYPR podcast, as a matter of fact.
A place where you used to work.
I recall those call letters. Yes. And their pledge drive is over finally. Boy, that thing was something else. I got nothing to say about it. Okay. All right, here we go. It's been, and I will say this about the process with the Stoop, is that we reach out with the idea for a theme for a show, and then folks self-select to be in touch with us, and then we have the pleasure of reaching out to them and getting kind of sneak peeks at their stories, and talking, giving them a chance to practice their stories. And I will say, you're in for a treat. These are all artists, I think, that Esther would smile upon and be proud of what art has meant to them, and then what they have done, turned around and done to make it mean for the community around them. Okay, so we have 3 storytellers this evening, and the first up to the microphone is a Baltimore native, a professional photographer and artist. She moved to Charleston, South Carolina in the 90s, raised her 2 daughters down there after establishing herself as a photographer in South Carolina by photographing fine art portraiture, weddings, cotillions. Those exist in South Carolina. She also shot editorial photography for Charleston Magazine and lots of other assignments. She eventually found a home in designing composite digital art for commercial and residential spaces. She's currently working on her project, Local Map Art, designing maps from her photographs. It's our pleasure to welcome to the stage Lauren Preller.
Hi, I'm Lauren. So my story starts when my husband, who was in shipping, we all moved to Charleston, South Carolina in the late, I think it was 96. I had 2 very young girls. They were 2 and 5 at the time. I was starting over, basically, had never lived outside of Baltimore. Was from here, big family here. So we moved to Charleston. It was quite a culture shock. It not only was it all new, I didn't know anyone. It's like moving back into the 1950s. Charleston was kind of not like it is today. The lights blinked downtown in the winter because there was no traffic. The only grocery store was the Piggly Wiggly. You could only get, the only kind of lettuce was iceberg lettuce. And that alone was a shock for me. But I got to say, I was very lonely. I didn't know anyone. And the people that I was beginning to meet weren't really going to be my friends, I could tell, because they're going to have me for dinner. So I remember the first social outing my husband and I had. It was a shipping company, and there were other couples at this dinner. It was at a restaurant, and they had names that were after the streets in Charleston. Maybank Highway, the Maybanks were there. Ravenel Bridge, the Ravenels were there. Cummins Street. So anyway, there was one woman in particular I could tell was kind of trying to figure me out. And she was asking a lot of questions, and she said, so where do you live? And I said, well, on Gibbs Street. And Charleston's like the size of Towson. It's very small. She said, Gibbs Street? Well, that's south of Broad. I'm like, yeah, it's south of Broad geographically, but I knew what she meant. It was really where old Charlestonians lived. It was, so she starts like, well, what unit block of Gibbs Street are you on? So, of course, the houses change a little bit in size. So, I am sarcastic, so I just said, look, it's the smallest house on the street, and we rent. Well, she didn't bat an eye. She goes, well, I guess you can put kittens in the oven, doesn't make them biscuits. And I laughed at first because I always have a delayed reaction until I realized the insult I was given. But this is my welcome to Charleston. And, it was all about who is your daddy, their heritage, their ancestry. It was very small. At the time, there was a Supreme Court battle going on about the Citadel, which was the crown jewel of Charleston. This is a military college that half of the, old Charlestonians went to, going back for God knows how long. And this battle, this woman, Shannon Faulkner, was suing the college to allow women to attend. And, I was like, well, yeah. But everybody there was like, that is ludicrous, a woman to attend the college. And, all of this I felt so isolated by, there was no one I could commiserate with. They had they revered their reenactors. They had Civil War reenactions every other weekend. It was why you would want to reenact a war you lost, I have no idea, but they were very proud of that. So, they had that going on, and I mean no disrespect, because I kind of still, I had this love-hate relationship with Charleston. But this Citadel piece, I can remember I had a friend come down, Kathleen Cahill. She's a civil rights attorney from Baltimore. So she comes down to visit us, and my husband, who has a little bit of a twisted sense of humor, decides to take her to a Citadel football game. And unbeknownst to me or her, he sits her next to a third-generation Citadel alum. And you have to understand, at the time, the Post and Courier, the paper, the newspaper, what paper? The paper, Lauren. I'm like this. So the headlines every day were, the Supreme Court battle going on. So he decides to sit Kathleen next to a third-generation Citadel alum. I don't know it, but I do realize during the game, it's a beautiful day, we're having fun, but that conversation's starting to get kind of lively. A couple on the other side of my husband. But in the meantime, that's getting a little louder. Halftime's coming up, and two things converge at the same time. It was insane. All of a sudden, hear Kathleen go, well, sir, there is no way the Supreme Court cannot allow women in the Citadel. It's the law. And he goes, he stands up and goes, you can take your Yankee ass and your Yankee values back up north where they belong. And with that, right behind us, the entire row starts cheering. And on top of that, I see in the field Shannon Faulkner, the plaintiff for the suing the Citadel being burned in effigy on the field. I'm serious. It was kind of terrifying. And we thought it might be a good time to leave. And so we left. But again, you know, at the time I was actually a little nervous at the time, but then I became furious. I became so angry. I had 2 little girls that I was like, if they want to go to military school, God, I hope they never do. But if they did, they should be allowed to go. I came of age during the 70s, feminism, that kind of thing. And I saw my mom with 7 kids. She was so talented, but could never have, expressed herself with it because of that. Anyway, I just saw I just saw the injustice in it. And, the far-reaching injustice of it. So, I'm riding downtown and I see these women in these hoop skirts they call the Daughters of the Confederacy. And they're in front of this building. And you have to be, your lineage to be in this. And then I'd see the reenactors, walking around downtown because you'd always see them. And I'm like, you know what? One of the most blasphemous things I could do is to put women in Confederate uniforms. And I decided to do it. I didn't know how, but I decided to just, you have to understand, some people wouldn't understand how sacrilegious that is in Charleston. But at the time, it definitely was, probably even now might be a little bit. So anyway, I wound up putting an ad. I needed to get the women because I really didn't know anybody. And I did shoot for a magazine called Skirt, kind of a progressive local women's magazine. And I said, can I put like an ad to get some women? And I did a self-portrait of me in a Confederate uniform. And I said, looking for a few good women. Athletic in spirit, rebellious in spirit, athletic in stature for a photo shoot I wanted to do. I was going to do a protest photo shoot. It was evolving like a train that I couldn't stop. And everything opened up. I was able to get these, the very expensive Confederate uniforms from a theater company that did North and South. I bartered for them. I worked quite a while after that, but I wanted 12 women on this battery gas on this battered wall. So I put it was a big undertaking, and I wound up putting this ad in. I got a great response. I got, actually about 100 responses. I picked 12 women based on the strength of their faces, their jaws. I just wanted to show the imagery of strength. And they came to my house. They lived on Sullivan's Island. We got them all dressed. We had these racks of Confederate uniforms. We went and did the shoot. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. I mean, meeting these women, too, were probably the first women I had met that kind of thought like I did. So we do the shoot. I decided to do an exhibit at a place downtown Charleston called the Roxy Theater. It's not there anymore, but it's kind of like the Charles here. And I have this, I decided to call it Local Hero Exhibit. And I have, we have the exhibit, and like hundreds of people showed up. It was amazing. Because I was like a virtual nobody, unknown, I couldn't believe this many people showed up for this. And they got it. They got what the image was about. And I found my tribe. And like I wasn't lonely anymore. And it was just like I fell in love with Charleston. Thanks.
In case it's not obvious, there's the picture. That's super awesome. Yeah. I hope it offended lots of people. Okay, so our next individual, and when I say storyteller, I want to be real clear. Lauren's a person outside of the Stoop. We had not met before this process, but now you feel a bit like family. So we call them storytellers, but they're just folks that we have the luck to be able to feature on the Stoop. So our next featured storyteller is the Reverend Gray Maggiano. He's the pastor at the Memorial Episcopal Church in Center West Baltimore. Before that, he was trying to end corruption in Afghanistan and still trying to figure out which is harder. He and Monica have 2 kids who are working to make his hair match his name. Please welcome the Reverend Gray.
Is there a way to put the picture away for a minute? Just pretend you didn't see that. You know what's a great word? Ineffable. Ineffable. When something is so big, so grand, so out there that you just cannot put words to it. The first time I saw Bernini's St. Teresa and Ecstasy in Rome was an ineffable moment for me. It's how I felt when I met my wife for the first time, 3 a.m. outside of the basement of a bus station that would turn into a gay nightclub. It's a whole other story. Ineffable. And it's how I felt the moment that when the Reverend Natalie Conway sat me down in our church and told me that the founders of the church had enslaved her ancestors. Ineffable. It's a great word. It's a great word because it sort of sounds like another word that I wanted to say at that moment. But let's back up a little bit before I get deeper into the story. I didn't know then, but I know now, that Natalie had to make a whole bunch of choices before she came and told me that story. She had learned from her brother and her brother's Ancestry.com research that their family had been enslaved at Hampton Plantation, and she learned that the founder of our church, Charles Ridgely Howard, had been born at Hampton Plantation, and she learned that they had been born, her ancestor, Hattie Cromwell, who was her great-grandmother, had been born the same year as Charles Ridgely Howard, in the same place at Hampton Plantation. And he was born free, and she was born enslaved. And she learned all this, but she didn't know if she was going to tell anybody. Because, and friends, I don't know if you know this, but white people don't always react well when you tell the truth about racism. I know, shocking. So she had to decide if she could tell me this story. And while I am super proud and excited that she was willing to tell the story and all that it has meant for our church and our community, I feel a little bit of shame that I had the potential to be the first stumbling block in that effort. Ineffable. But she told me the story, and then I knew immediately this was something we had to go and tell a lot of people. But it had to be on her terms, with her wishes, and in her way. Why? Because, friends, I don't know if you know this, but white people don't always make a great environment for black people to talk about race. Or as another parishioner said to me, Gray, I like these people, and I'm afraid they're going to say something that's going to change that. It could have been easier for her to just kind of quiet quit and go away. Or just stay in the church and pretend like she didn't know this story. But that, for her, would have been ineffable. So instead, July 2019, she sat me down inside the church right after services under a plaque to Charles Ridgely Howard. The church is it's Memorial Episcopal Church. It was a memorial to Charles Ridgely Howard. And as we sat under this plaque to Charles Ridgely Howard, she said, Gray, Charles Ridgely Howard enslaved my great-grandmother, Hattie Cromwell, at Hampton Plantation. Ineffable. I did not know what to say, and I did not know what we were going to do. The first thing that we did was we gathered as a community and we went to Hampton Plantation. And we visited the gardens, visited the manor house, visited the slave quarters. And if you've ever been to Hampton, you walk into this big, great room, and it is filled with portraits. There must be 100 portraits in this room, including portraits of Charles Ridgely Howard and his parents and great-grandparents and all these other people. And so I asked Natalie, do you have any photos or any pictures of Hattie? And she said, yes, just one. It's no joke, about the size of my thumb. And it was, a copy of a picture probably taken around the turn of the century after she was freed. And that was all she had. And suddenly there's this kernel of an idea, right? How can we put words to this ineffable moment? How can we make this something else? So now you can put the picture up. I'm not an artist, right? I can't sing, I can't dance, I can't paint. In high school, when I had to take art class as a required course, they put me in photography instead because I was so bad. I was in the marching band for a year, but my job was just to hold the tuba and stand because I was the only kid who could hold it. I wasn't allowed to play. This is not a joke. But one thing I do pride myself on is being able to know and make relationships with a lot of people. And so I reached out to some friends who were artists, and I said, do you know somebody, a young black artist from Baltimore who works in portraiture, who might be able to help tell this story? And so I was introduced to Des Thaniel. Des, at that point, was a student at MICA. She's now at Morgan State. And she sat down with Natalie and with Natalie's family and met with them multiple times to hear their story. And what she came back with was this. If you can see, this is 32 families, the 32 families that were enslaved at Hampton Plantation. That's just a copy, so if it falls, nobody freak out. 32 families that were enslaved at Hampton Plantation. The only face is Hattie's, because we don't have images of the other families that were enslaved at Hampton. But look at the grandeur of this painting. The honor and the dignity and the pride that these people were given. They weren't allowed to have this in life, but now it exists for posterity. And Des was able to tell that story, and in the process, give our congregation something to work with, some way to move forward. So we put this out front of the church at the corner of Bolton and Lafayette for 4 years. We had to take it down because it was getting damaged by the sun, but don't worry, it's in the church. And it began to work on us. And we noticed that Des had quite literally painted the path forward for us. Just as she had been able to give honor and dignity and pride to these people, so we needed to do what we could to bring honor and dignity and pride to the communities that our ancestors had harmed at Memorial. Because turns out it wasn't just those 2 priests who had slaves. It was most of the people who founded the church had enslaved people. And for 100 years, the church was a leader in segregation and furthering Jim Crow laws here in Baltimore. The Daughters of the Confederacy that Lauren was talking about, they were headquartered at the church. The first housing segregation ordinance was written in the parish hall of the church by the senior warden, the basically, I don't know, president of the board of the church. They founded the Mount Royal Protective Association for the express purposes of keeping black people out of what is now the Bolton Hill neighborhood. There was a lot that we had to work through, and a lot that we had to undo. But Des had painted the path for us. So it was easy then in 2021 when our church voted to start a reparations fund and invest $500,000 back into the 21217 zip code. People didn't bat an eye because they had seen what happens through art when you offer that honor and dignity and pride and power back. And they wanted to be a part of that. I did not think I would do this when I moved to Baltimore. This was not the plan. But because of Dez's work, because of Natalie's story, and the art that she has made out of her life, it's changed my life, it's changed our congregation's life, and it's changed, I think, our whole community's life. And so I am proud to stand here with all of you to show how art can change things. And I hope you all will find ways to follow the art that you see in the world to make this world better. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Gray. Ineffable. All right, we have one more storyteller to bring to the stage here as this part of the program. It is my pleasure to do so. The storyteller you're about to hear from is a distinguished fine artist and a muralist with more than a decade of experience. His remarkable talent lies in his ability to craft these large format geometric artworks that exude boundless energy and optimism, like the city of Baltimore, and like him, the city where he was raised, Baltimore. And it says here in his intro, there is more than meets the eye. You're about to hear for yourself. Please welcome Wendell Supreme Shannon.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Wendell Supreme Shannon. I am a muralist and fine artist. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, August 9th of 1990. But soon after, my mother relocated here to Baltimore. Now, my mother was someone who left a very big impression on me because she moved with a sense of urgency. Whatever she wanted, she needed, and whatever she needed, she obtained. Now, while in Baltimore, we moved around a lot. This was something that forced me to learn how to adapt to different environments relatively quickly. Different parts of the city, different environment. Before long, we eventually settled in part of Baltimore County called Cockeysville. Now, here was a lot different from everywhere else that we've been. I was introduced to a wide range of different ethnicities, different cultures, and different lifestyles. It was here that I became this charismatic, fun-loving, humor-filled person that was just ready for whatever the world had to offer. Everything wasn't always so great, though. During my high school years was the first time that I actually experienced someone not believing in me. It was said by someone close, someone that I loved, that they didn't believe that I'd graduate high school or that I'd live up to my name. Fortunate enough for me, I was in close proximity to a great individual. This individual's name was Lamont. He was a student at a nearby college, and he took me under his wing as a mentee. Taught me any and everything that I needed to know, just being a young black man in a different world. So when I graduated high school, I wanted to go to the same college he did. I registered and applied to Morgan State with acceptance. I followed suit and took the same major that he did, which was business administration. But this is where my story took a turn. 2 years into going after my degree, I actually was diagnosed with several autoimmune diseases. In summary, my heart wasn't strong enough to pump blood to my extremities, and I lost the use of my hands for about 2 years. Simply put, I couldn't open or close my hands. Literally at this moment, just because we're in a room that's so cold, my hands are turning blue. Nonetheless, the doctors told me that I had to withdraw from school. That was something that I wouldn't be able to complete. I wouldn't be able to work a regular job. I'd be dependent upon medicine for the rest of my life. I really wasn't agreeing with that too much. 19, 20-year-old, and you're telling me the rest of my life I wouldn't be able to do anything? So my family and I decided to try out physical therapy. And in doing so, we had to, I was forced to learn how to rewrite letters, numbers, and shapes. That's how intensive this disease was. But with the shapes, I would literally, line for line, just draw straight lines over and over throughout the day. Lo and behold, these diseases went into remission. Something in me told me that that wasn't good enough. See, over those 2 years, a lot of my friends that were still in school ended up graduating, going off to starting their careers. I had to prove that I was good enough. So I took what I learned at Morgan in reference to business and applied it to my newfound passion of art and started my first business called Solely Supreme. Years went by of me painting any and everything under the sun, from portraits to caricatures, landscapes to whatever people wanted. Scrolling on Instagram, I came across this call for artists to a professional show. It was premier artists, seasoned veterans in the industry, but something in me told me to do it. Of course, I got the rejection. In the email response, there were 3 things that stood out. I was told that the work that I submitted was unoriginal, that my submission itself lacked professionalism, and that I wasn't ready for this league. And if you can tell by now, being told something like that just turns a fire on inside. So over the next 2 months, I churned away and developed my first geometric abstract painting, where I perfected freehand painting straight lines, layering so much color, so much vibrant usage of color, where when someone saw this work, they couldn't help but notice it. Luckily for me, I was on the callback list, and I made it into that same show. I guess you can imagine which piece I took. Upon submitting it, opening day of the said show, artist by the name of Larry Poncho Brown told me that this piece itself was something seldom seen and extremely rare, especially being done by a young black artist here in Baltimore. For me, that was all I needed to hear. Over the next few years, I cultivated that specific style, practicing color theory, learning to scale it, learning to freehand it even more, applying different elements and details, just being extremely passionate about my work. In the year 2019, I came across a video of Poe Holmes. There we go. Poe Holmes at the time was experiencing a water crisis. Now, if you're not familiar with the area, Poe Holmes is an underserved community in West Baltimore. for a few weeks, the entire community went without water. One of the things that I noticed was a lot of small businesses, entrepreneurs, and community leaders were there donating waters, donating food. I wanted to do something that stood the test of time, brought the right attention, and gave the community itself a voice. So I reached out to several partners in addition to the city of Baltimore, and as you guessed, I got one of those kind of emails again. The city responded that they had no plans of developing the area, and if it was something that I really wanted to do, it would have had to be self-funded. Me and some friends went to social media. We crowdfunded over $10,000 to be able to facilitate the project. That took a little bit of time, but we got it done. Once we finally got down to painting, we had over 40 volunteers from several different states, in addition to the children and the adults in the community, come out and help paint this court. It left a lasting impression that said, we have a voice, we are here, and we deserve. Whenever any of you see my work, it's my hope that you see the same, that positivity, that light shines within you. I used to think that my purpose in life was to prove other people wrong, to prove that I could accomplish what you said I couldn't. When in all actuality, I'm now realizing that my superpower is simply whatever I can imagine, I know I can make it real, and I just want that to be a reminder to you too. Thank you.
All right, so those are our 3 stories from the Stoop. So thank you again to the Reverend Gray and to Wendell and to Lauren. And we're going to turn it over now to the rest of the event. Thank you so much.
I just have a few words to say. So I won't take more time away from the real speakers this evening. I just want to say that you were all fantastic. Really, really fantastic. I made a little note for myself a few days ago that art speaks to what it means to be human. And I think each of you discovered that in yourselves or in your church, in your congregation. And it is, of course, what my mother's work expresses, that the experience she had as a young girl stayed with her, and she found her voice in order to be able to express what it was like to express her humanity. Our next guest is Eric Ward. I am so thrilled to be able to welcome him here today. Eric and I spent some time earlier walking through my mother's exhibit, and I could tell it left a big impression on him. But Eric has a lot to say about the kinds of experiences that my mother had, what she experienced historically, and that is still with us today. And I'm really looking forward, I know all of us are really looking forward to hearing his thoughts and insights into these connections among these different strains of hate that still find union despite some apparent differences. So I want to welcome Eric, and I want to welcome as well Cecile Lipworth, who is a very dear friend and a board member of Art and Remembrance, who will be engaged in a conversation with Eric. So please welcome to the stage.
I'm just going to move chairs a minute because it feels very formal.
What do you think, Cecile?
Is that good? Can you all see us? I like to be cozy. I like to be cozy. Hello. Hi.
How are you, Cecile?
I'm good. How are you?
Really moved.
Yeah,
this
me
evening.
too. What an incredible presentation. Thank you to all three of you. Just showing us the power that art has to change our communities. So, thank you to AVAM and Rebecca and Becker and to Art and Remembrance for existing. And I'm very proud to be a board member of this organization. And before I begin, I usually tell everyone, so you don't all sit here wondering if I'm Australian or British, I'm South African. So this is a topic that's really interesting for me. I grew up in apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 80s. And actually this morning delved a little bit into my own Jewish history in South Africa. So we can get to that.
Absolutely.
But it's an honor to be here. And I want to really begin by saying that when I think of Esther and how she tried to make sense of what was happening and what had happened to her family and the circumstances that gave rise to Hitler, she didn't have the internet. She didn't have the ability to have critical analysis and professionals telling her what was going on. And so at the age of 50, as Bernice said, she took what she knew best, which was sewing, and she created art. And I'm just curious how many people here in the audience have actually been through the exhibition. So for those of you who have, you know the extraordinary extent of her art and creativity, which Eric just got to witness. But for us tonight, and for me, it's a great privilege to have Eric with us, a man who's given me incredible insight already as I've read his work and watched his interviews, and I hope he's going to do the same for all of you here this evening. I'm honored to talk with you and learn more from you, and I'm not going to read his bio because it is on your flyer, but he's an exceptional...
Mostly made up anyway.
Well, I don't know. I've talked to you a little bit. I don't think so. This week has been especially hard for us, ineffable, actually. And, but we're not going to talk about that piece of the conversation this evening. I want to talk with Eric about the complicated world as it stands right now, hoping he can enlighten us all about the context of racism, anti-Semitism, the ideology of white supremacy, white nationalism. And I also want to explore the creativity that Eric himself participates in, his art form. So I'm going to start by asking you, Eric, how did you come to be an expert on racism, anti-Semitism, white nationalism?
Yeah, I'm going to tell that story. I don't know about you, Cecile. I am super, in my brain, nervous up here tonight. Are you feeling that too?
Totally.
So,
I don't want to mess this up.
So folks may not know this. I'm a terrible folk singer. I don't really know the difference between folk and punk anyway, but I'm a little bit of both. And so this is going to come to the answer. So every once in a while, I'll get up on stage and I'll sing a few songs, or folks who I know who are real musicians, will let me get on stage and kind of open up while everyone else is setting up the chairs, and play. And I realized something when I was sitting up on a stage once, which is my body cannot tell the difference between excitement and nervousness, right? It actually just responds exactly the same way. So I'm telling in my head right now, I'm actually not nervous. I'm actually very excited to be here with you all tonight. And I'm excited to have this conversation. I mostly spend time in the world of social change. And very exciting,
very dynamic, and super boring at times. And boring because often we've taken social change and we've made it like a science, right? We do a lot of data and surveying. And I also think what we saw from Esther tonight, right, is that social change is also an art. So you can be an artist. You don't have to be a scientist. And I'm excited to be able to sit in this space tonight with the family of Esther. Rachel, you should stand up, actually. And I think everyone in Esther's family, if you feel comfortable, I think you should stand up. We are in Esther's house tonight. And, like, really. And Esther is a punk rocker, which gets me back to the answer. Okay, so full loop. Side note, if you cannot tell, I grew up Southern Baptist, so it can take me an hour to introduce. But
We've got 45 minutes.
we have 45 minutes. So it's the 80s in LA. So I grew up in LA. I'm the third now of 5 generations of Black Los Angeles. My family on my dad's side flees Shepherdsville, Kentucky in the early 1900s after a lynching, and we believe it's the lynching of Mariel Thompson of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. And my great aunt is coming around, the story is that she's coming around the road in a horse and buggy, which I'm pretty sure was a mule in a cart, right? And this is happening. And over the next weeks and months, she packs up the family and moves them all the way west. They're going to San Francisco. Now, you can imagine in that time, travel wasn't getting on a plane or train. It took a long time to move west. They get to Arizona, and they find out there's a big earthquake that just took place in San Francisco. They decided they were not going to Northern California, and they settled in Los Angeles. I came of age at a time, so I was born in an age, and I think this is important, where black people legally in this country were not considered to be full human beings. It was the law of the land. That is the America I was born in. But it was an America that was starting to come to an end because of the rise of the civil rights movement. So I come of age in junior high school and high school in the period of desegregation of the public schools in Los Angeles and then Long Beach, California. Now, desegregation, pluses and minuses, right? But you have to imagine in that period, right, it is kids looking for belonging, right? What brings us together? And I can tell you right now, that was not going to be race in America. That was not going to be the bridge that brought us together. It was one of those moments when something new happened, and it was the rise of something called punk and hip-hop. Now, we didn't know the difference. I'm going to tell you that right now, right? I was telling someone earlier, all we knew was it wasn't Barry Manilow, right? It wasn't Captain and Tennille. It was something new, and it seemed to, like, speak to us, and our parents didn't like it, and it was good, right? And it made us excited and nervous. So I come up in the Los Angeles punk scene in the 1980s. Now, mostly, it's an art-driven punk scene. It's art students, it's old glam musicians. But quickly, it inspires folks, right? And it inspires a lot of people for a lot of different reasons, including nihilism. So what happens in the 1980s is soon other folks start showing up at these shows. These folks weren't about inclusion. In fact, they were the folks who had been beating us up probably 2 or 3 years before. Folks forget, right? If you were a punk rocker, that could get you on a gang list in Los Angeles, right? Your parents might kick you out of your house if you were a punk rocker, right? Or put you in a mental health hospital. That's what it was like to be a punk rocker. But these folks were showing up, and these folks were bringing the bigotry that had existed, the reaction to desegregation into these shows. And so we were left with a choice, right? Did we flee this only space where we felt belonging across lines of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or did we fight for it? And we decided that we were going to fight for the only home that we had. Now, I'm not here to romanticize that, right? For us, we didn't have parents, right? We didn't have helicopter parents then. We were called latchkey kids, right? My mom didn't know much about what happened, after I got out of school. And most of us weren't going to tell our parents what was going on. We were sneaking into clubs we weren't supposed to be in. And these confrontations were happening. They followed me up into Oregon in the mid-'80s, in the early '90s. So here's what happens. Here's how I get into this work. I just think these are a bunch of bullies, and you just stand up to bullies, and they just happen to be bigots. But you just stand up to them, and your friends, you come together and you stand up. We don't have a deep understanding. It's a simple, right? Those are the enemy, right? And we are the folks trying to defend our space. One of the ways that we decided to spend and defend our space was by researching these folks. We started to realize they belonged to groups like American Front, White Aryan Resistance. The name went on. So we started to research. And research meant either going to meetings. So I attended my first white nationalist meeting, imagine this, as an African American, right, in the spring of 1991 at the Salem Fairgrounds in Oregon. And we'll get to how I did that, right? We also started to collect their literature. And one part of their literature were flyers. They used to love the flyer. They probably killed more trees than any other social movement in America, right? Along with people, right? And these flyers were vile. I don't use them in presentations. People do. I thought they were vile. I still think they're vile and they're shocking, and I won't use their propaganda, right? And these flyers were super racist, right? Anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBTQ, anti-homeless, you name it, right? These flyers were vile. But as we were collecting them and trying to understand what the messages were and what neighborhoods they were targeting for organizing, I began and others began to notice something really interesting. That these flyers always seemed to contain some reference to the Jewish community. It didn't matter who else they were talking about, right? And so these flyers would have a Star of David, right, or some anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish man, typically. I talk about this holding strings like he was a puppet master over the media or black people or Latinos or interracial couples. The truth is I wanted to figure out what this movement was because I wanted to defend my community. My community was made up of mostly alienated and lost kids in America. That's who we were. And we found each other, and we were sometimes the only family we had. And we wanted to defend ourselves. And I understood at the end of the day, to defend ourselves, I needed to understand why they were so fixated on Jews. And that's how I became to understand this work in the early 90s. I'll tell it really quickly. The truth is what I came to understand was that anti-Semitism was the driving narrative of this white nationalist movement. This white nationalist movement wasn't like the white supremacists of the old, right? They weren't looking to take us back to the days of Gone with the Wind. That these were folks who were no longer interested in the exploitation of people of color. They were interested in our removal. That they saw us as nothing more than puppets of a Jewish conspiracy drawn from a novel, an anti-Semitic a narrative called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Today it's called the Great Replacement Theory, which is just the Protocols 2.0. And it was a story that spread in the early 1900s, right, in Europe, propagated by Russian secret police who were scared about democracy in Europe. Boy, that sounds familiar. And in this narrative, it purports to tell a story of Jewish elders who gather in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover of European Christendom through control of the media, through control of the finance, right? Control of the arts. And it is that narrative that comes to America. What we began to understand as artists was that narratives carry power. And they carry power whether they're conscious or they're unconscious in our society. You may not think you know the protocols of the elders of Zion, but the truth is most of us are unconsciously familiar with that narrative and the unconscious bias that comes by it. Now, I'm going to give a guy a shout out, but I don't want folks walking out saying, oh, Eric said he's an anti-Semite. That's not my point. The point is to tell you the power of this narrative. Have folks ever heard of Chris Carter and his show, The X-Files? Raise your hand if you were an X-Files fan. I was a big X-Files fan. Wow. Okay, you all need to watch a little more pop culture. So, The X-Files was a TV series about two FBI agents, right, who discovered that there was a secret alien invasion going on in the world, and that these aliens were seeking, right, to infect the human gene pool, right, with their alien virus so that they could take over the planet, right? And that these aliens had cut a deal with those in government, in the arts, and the finances. In short, Chris Carter was actually retelling the protocols. Most alien invasion stories are a little bit of retellings of the protocols, right? It's a narrative that has been effective because of its power. And at the end of the day, while racism, Islamophobia, right, transphobia, you name it, is active in this white nationalist movement, what we came to understand was this narrative of anti-Semitism underlying it, right, was really feeding this movement. That hate groups didn't come into our communities bringing anti-Semitism with it. That they were simply tapping into the anti-Semitism that already existed. As I attended these meetings, right, imagine an African American, right, and think about the binary of race in America, right? Whiteness framed as superior, right? Blackness on the other end of that spectrum as inferior. We live in a country that is constantly trying to escape blackness, right? Everybody is trying to get as far away from blackness in this country as they can because it's one of the narratives. But how did I function in this story? And now I'm going to come to a close.
It's okay. You've actually answered question 2, 3,
This is
and
question
4.
2, 3, and 4 right now.
I have nothing more to
We're going to go there. So it's 1991, 92, something like that. And I'm going to something called the Preparedness Expo, an alternative health exhibit. It was over 4 days at the Seattle Center. And it was the kind of anchor of the white nationalist movement. Yes, you could get alternative health products, but you could hear from the latest leadership in the white nationalist movement. You could buy their literature, right, in tables scattered around the exhibit floor. I come up into the meeting, right? I had already been at some meetings. And this one capitalizes exactly how I could walk around in these meetings. I walk into the meeting, and there's lots of people there, thousands. All of a sudden, I see this guy see me. He spots me, right? Big hulking guy. He's baseball cap. He sees me, and he starts coming straight at me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is about to get interesting, right? And he is walking at me with purpose. And he gets like about 5 feet from me, and he stops and he smiles and he puts out his hand and he says, my name is Bear, and I'm so glad you're here, right? And so I looked at him and I said, it's nice to meet you, Bear, but I don't shake hands with white people. That's not true, by the way, right? And without skipping, he just nods his head like he totally gets that, right? And he says, but it's good to see you here, right? Why are you here? And I said, well, I'm here because, I've been talking with other brothers and, we're preparing for collapse and I'm just here to see and check things out, right? Folks sent me. And he said, well, I'm glad you're here because there's a speaker who's about to go on. His name is Jack McGlam, who is a former sheriff, head of the a group called Police Against the New World Order. And he says, McGlam has been telling us that we need to build like a broader alliance, he said. That we need, in his own words, we need to reach out to black people and Orientals and Mexicans, right? And that we need to take on the federal government and then take on the real problem in America, right? Now, I have to tell you all what he meant when he said the real problem, right? At the end of the day, what he was talking about was this narrative of anti-Semitism. And the fact that I would be positively responsive to that narrative was enough for me to be part of that coalition. And if you don't understand the power of that, look at the image of January 6th at the Capitol. Look at the Proud Boy leadership. Look at how many people of color are starting to be attracted to this authoritarian message. At the end of the day, what I came to understand was that if we couldn't make anti-Semitism visible, we would never be able to successfully counter and disrupt this narrative that is influencing all of us.
Thank you.
40 minutes up, we're done.
We're done. We literally are. My question was make it make sense how the anti-Semitism, racism, and white nationalism come together. But I think what's really interesting as well, what you just brought up, was January 6th. And I think, you know, what in your article, Skin of the Game, you said something like our ignorance about the country we live in, yes, meaning America. I grew up, as I said, in South Africa. My own ignorance was enormous. We were protected as white people from not knowing the news. We didn't get television till 1976 because the government didn't want us to know what was going on. And our main newspaper in Johannesburg, where I grew up, was government run, and you know, they determined what was the news. So we never knew what was going on in our own country. We didn't know the horrors that were going on. Well, I didn't. I was young and growing up, but I didn't know that. And I think when you talk about sort of January 6th, it suddenly seemed like America was waking up to the horrors of what had been bubbling under the surface. The white nationalists certainly were under the rock until this igniting flame came to bring them all out, or not bring them out, but he certainly gave them the fuel that they needed. Donald Trump gave them the fuel. He was the ignition that allowed this convergence of anti-blackness, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. It all happened in this amazing, like, coming together of ideals around anti-Semitism, anti-blackness, and white supremacy that we're seeing right now. And I'm just like curious how you see that like formation. Obviously, it's been decades in the making. I myself have learned so much over just the historical nature of what has happened over the past 40, 50 years in America. But I'm just curious what you think about that sort of confluence of influence, you know, that brought it all together to ignite it to where we are today. This, yes. And this, what you said to me, the scarcity mentality, yes, of where we're at, that there's not enough for everybody, yes, you know?
Yes, I mean, we get into this point, right? So it's interesting. I'm going to go back to Esther for a second in her exhibit. Yeah, if you haven't seen this, you really should. It is like really, it is punk rock, right? In the sense of like finding 3 chords and writing an entire album. And if anyone knows what I'm talking about, right? The power of finding one's story and sharing it so that it is a universal story is incredible. So I'm going to do this in the spirit of Esther, right? But I got to give a little kind of a preamble. So going back to the science of social change, there's lots of studies that tell us in this country, right, even saying the word racism, right, and white supremacy, right, raises people's blood pressure and anxiety, right? Isn't that amazing? So racism, right? White supremacy. Look, okay, breathe it all out, right? Look, none of us were here for the construction of white supremacy, right? It was something that was generational, and interesting enough, it has its roots in anti-Semitism, and you can ask me that later, but I'm going to jump ahead a few hundred years, right? So we have this thing called the United States. The United States of America is socially constructed, right? And the social construction of white supremacy is core. And it's built off of 3 pillars. The first is the stolen land, right? And lives of indigenous people, right? The second is a brutal system, right, of slavery called chattel slavery. And if you don't understand the brutality of that system, you should find a book that is now out of print before states start banning it, called A Peculiar Institution. It is one of the best documentations on how brutal this system was, right? That black people even found their way forward, right, is a testament to our resilience, right, coming out of that system. The third, we often don't talk about, but is totally in play every day, right, is the control of sexuality, really the control of women, misogyny. These are the 3 pillars of white supremacy. It is what allows the United States to build this economic system and become the powerhouse that it is today, right? But it's grounded in another narrative, and the narrative is called white superiority, right? And white superiority is not something you got to think about, right? So you have to convince your neighbor of it. It is the law of the land. It is the cultural norm of the land. And everything is built upon this basis of whiteness, as I said, being superior, right? Blackness being inferior, right? It is race. So now imagine, now I'm going to jump forward a few more hundred years. Imagine then we get to this place in the 1950s, really the 1940s, but we call it the 1960s civil rights movement, right? And along comes these black folks and their allies, and they topple white supremacy as the rule of law. Now, I'm not here saying white supremacy isn't here anymore, right? It's de facto, trust me, right? But as the rule of law, it is toppled and it is given a competitor. That competitor is called multiracial democracy or inclusive democracy. Black folks call for a universalism, right? That is people-centered, transparent, and accountable government, right? That affords opportunity to all. Now imagine for a second, close your eyes, because this is hard today in 2023 for most of us. But imagine for a second, you were raised as an arch segregationist. You believe, like the air you breathe, that black people are inferior. Okay, shake that off and open your eyes. How do you come to terms that you lost with folks you have been conditioned to see as inferior? You all of a sudden say, well, I guess I was wrong there, right? Not likely. Most of us don't admit when we're wrong. So they had to construct this idea. So they borrowed from the protocols with some help from Henry Ford, right, who had republished the protocols, has the International Jew, a series of essays in his newspaper, which he distributed, right, through his auto dealerships around the country, exposing hundreds of thousands of Americans. White World War II veterans coming back from Europe, also exposed to the multiple, I think the Nazi Europe published something like over 36 editions of the protocols, right, during its reign alone. It was an idea that steeped into America. But there was another reason that it steeped into America. It steeped into America because America was already ready to condition race. And here's the trick about anti-Semitism in America. It's not a religious form of bigotry, right? Jews are racialized. They're seen as a racial other or sometimes something other than race. That's how we get here. But then, imagine this. You're that that arch segregationist who is never going to believe that you lost to black people. So you have to insert a reason. And like all anti-Semites, Jews become that focus for the things of the anxieties and the explanations in society that explain loss and change, right? And so Jews became the reason, right, that black people were successful, or that women were able to organize for empowerment, or why immigrants were allowed to come to this country and only be half exploited, right? Or a list of other, in the face of these segregationists, other losses to culture. This is how we get to this moment. But then something else happens. Remember when I said earlier, like there was desegregation and kind of changed the rules of the game for a second, and then entered this like other thing called punk rock and hip hop that gave us bridges to come together? Well, in the moment of this white nationalist movement arc, something else happens, and it happens here in this country, right? And it happens in succession. The first, right, is the rise of something called MAGA and the alt-right, right? And it is a movement that is grounded, right, in two things: exclusion and scarcity. It is an idea that there are only limited things that we can do as humanity. Imagine that, right? The other thing that happens, right, on top of that political disruption, and I live in Portland, Oregon, so I witnessed, right, that 6 years, right, of political violence. 6 people shot over a 6-year period from that political violence, right? 6 people killed, 11 people shot, thousands of people injured in the political clashes that were happening on the streets. But there was also a pandemic, which we also don't talk about and choose not to remember, right? That has stolen millions of lives in this world. And then climate disaster. Nearly every area of this country and world has faced some form of climate disaster. These are destabilizing moments, right? And in destabilizing moments, all of us look for an anchor. And here comes to the truth. So now this was a long answer, but you said that we had a little bit of time. Here's the piece away. The truth is while these new moments give the white nationalist movement energy and its narrative energy and allows it to begin to attract a base who is feeling unstabilized, either from demographic change, right, or these things that are happening in society that the rest of us won't acknowledge or mourn or grieve, right? The real reason the white nationalist movement is winning, right, or gaining momentum is because we will not advance, right, what it looks like to actually live in a multiracial, inclusive democracy. We still believe, even though time and everything has changed, that the status quo is sufficient to speak to the moment. The white nationalist movement is winning because they know, right? We all know when a certain guy who used to be president says, "Make America great again," all of us know exactly what he means. The truth is when we say inclusive democracy or multiracial democracy, none of us actually have put that vision into a practice so that people can see it, taste it, feel it in real time. That same demographic anxiety that is allowing the white nationalist movement, right, to work is the same demographic anxiety that is preventing us to come together, right, to vision a new society that moves us all forward together, that is grounded in real principles of democracy. And the truth is that unless we give people a chance to experience what that looks like in real time, they'll always choose the thing that they already know, right? Even if it's unhealthy. My dad put it this way, he's 98. He tells a story about a woman, she thinks something is wrong with her arm. So she goes to the doctor. Doctor looks at her arm, and he says, no, there's nothing wrong with your arm. So on the way home, she stops at the butcher to get some meat. She's talking to the butcher. The butcher says, how are you doing? She said, I think something's wrong with my arm. He said, oh, what's going on? And she said, I don't know, but the doctor says there's nothing wrong. Well, 3 months later, she still thinks something is wrong with her arm. So she goes back to the doctor. Doctor takes a look at her arm, says, nothing's wrong with your arm. She says, oh, okay. On the way home, she stops at the butcher. Butcher says, how's your arm doing? She said, I don't know, I think something's wrong, but the doctor says nothing's wrong, right? He says, oh, that's too bad. A few months later, she's convinced something is wrong with her arm. She goes back to the doctor. Doctor looks at her arm. He says, there is nothing wrong with your arm. I don't want to see you again. She says, okay. On the way home, she stops at the butcher. Butcher says, how are you doing? He said, I just think something's wrong with my arm, but the doctor says there's nothing wrong with my arm. The butcher says, well, since you first told me that, I checked out some books in the library, about arm surgeries, and I don't know if I can do it, but I'm willing to try. My dad then says, so what's her choice point? Does she keep going back to the doctor who says nothing's wrong? Or does she take her shot with the butcher? Right? It's a funny story, but it's actually the state of the world right now. And the truth is white nationalism is just a form of authoritarianism driven off of scarcity, right? The fear of scarcity. It's actually a global phenomenon. It's just not always based in race. The truth is that if we actually believe in multiracial America, it's time for the rest of us to stand up for it. And standing up for it doesn't mean confronting Nazis, right? Standing up for it means investing in our communities, investing in governance, right? It's not all about protest, right? As my friend Kathleen Sadat tells me, Eric, she marched, she was a civil rights activist. She says, look, honey, the fight for belonging is over. We won that fight in 1968. There's no 2 out of 3 just because someone is unhappy with that. The fight now is, will we be allowed as a multiracial nation to govern or not? That's the question we need to call. But if we're not actually practicing governance, if we're not on the utility boards, right? If we're not on the boards of like museums and art centers and running for school boards, we are not giving people a glimpse of that multiracial America. Multiracial America is messy, but I gotta tell you, being one of the few people who actually grew up in that multiracial America, there is something beautiful and powerful about it. Something that is not built in scarcity. It is fully fueled by abundance, and we should embrace it.
Thank you. You have time? So I just want to play on that before. I don't think we have much more time, but unfortunately, but I just want to say I did live in South Africa in 1994 when the ANC came to power, Nelson Mandela came to power, and that feeling of when we all came together and standing in line to vote those days, and that feeling that we were being led by an incredibly visionary man who had the vision and the compassion and the empathy to not turn it around into a civil war, which we thought might happen, but who really led the country in a vision of what it could look like. It hasn't turned out that way, unfortunately. 30 years later, it's in crisis, the country. But that feeling that we stood in the streets and celebrated and understood that was the vision of a multiracial, multi-ethnic collaboration. And I'll just say, I think artists should be the people running the country.
Yes. Yes. I agree.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
need creativity in this moment to step into what you're saying of like not being afraid. And we were afraid. I will just tell you, I very clearly remember sitting at a Shabbat table having this conversation in my family and the fear we all felt before the election of what was going to happen to all of us. And so there is fear, but we can't step into that space unless we step into that space.
Yes.
I don't know if we have time for any questions from the audience. I have so many things to ask you.
And I talked a long time, so apologies.
Well, do we have 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, Becca? I don't know. Okay. My one question before we move into the creative art piece, because I do want to get to that, but my question that's sort of bubbling and bugging me in my head is the evangelical Christians in this country are evangelical Christian Zionists. They believe that, and I want to get it completely right, that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is a prerequisite for the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we have the evangelical Christians on one side, and we have the white supremacists on the other side. Why are they not fighting? Like, that's my question. Why are they not fighting about what's happening with the anti-Semitism?
Yeah, race. No, I mean, so the reason people build weird coalitions, right? But the narratives aren't that different. So you're hearing me talk about narratives. I'm really talking about storytelling, right? So authoritarians have 4 core stories that they tell that are best represented in books. And I'm trying to think if I even want to promote these books. But one I'm going to talk about, which comes out of the more kind of Christian right, and it's written in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, by a man by the name of Hal Lindsey. And it's a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And it is that narrative that becomes the dominant narrative within evangelical circles. But it wasn't always the dominant narrative. It ends, of course, right, with the nuclear bombing of Israel, right? Nuclear war in the Middle East, in this narrative, triggers the return of Christ. Now, let me, if you want to know why they're not fighting, let me compare that to the white nationalist narrative, which is a book called The Turner Diaries, by a neo-Nazi who's passed away by the name of William Pierce, who was a former professor of physics at Oregon State University, just so we're breaking the myth of people driving around in pickup trucks uneducated. And in his book, The Turner Diary, the story ends with white nationalists bombing Israel, right, and New York City, right? And I don't have to tell folks why New York City, right? It's because there is in the novel and real life, a strong population of the Jewish community there. The end games, right, of these narratives are very, very similar. And usually sitting in it, right, is either Jews who are cast as all evil, right, or good and bad Jews, which is also part of the anti-Semitic narrative as well. The truth is it's because in the narratives, there's not much difference. And the other truth is because it's about coalition, and people build weird coalitions in order to win control in a society. And it's not much more than that. The truth is neither of those movements are pushing bigotry, right, just because they're bigots. They're tapping into bigotry, right, in order to build political power. That's why we have the power to remove that oxygen. Trust me, I'm an organizer. I don't organize people around things that they are not already experiencing or feeling, right? So if the white nationalist movement is taking advantage of anti-Semitism, if the Christian right is taking advantage of anti-Semitism, or what may be called it's because it already exists in society. And that's why educating ourselves and pushing through, right, our unconscious anti-Semitism is important if we want the society we say we want.
Thank you. So my very last question is really, in Eric's bio, I think you can read, but here we go. You work with musicians to advance racial justice and inclusive democracy, and you use your singer-songwriting talents to help launch the Western State Center Inclusive Democracy Culture Club.
Yes.
So my question is really how the power of art to change us is enormous. And I'm just curious what you think, like, how do we actually incorporate that into everything we do so that we can truly, truly have people imagine what they can't when they're faced with all this constant barrage of information.
Things happening, right?
Yeah.
Misinformation, disinformation, that creates alienation, right? The truth is social media platforms have separated us. It has alienated us from one another, ironically, right? And I think what art is, particularly music, is about storytelling. And what I came to realize was my own binary, right? That in the white supremacist construct, the binary of one side or the other, right? That was not functioning in abundance. It actually wasn't a radical mindset. It was the most normal mindset in America, right? And so we wanted to find a different way. For us, it became important to understand this was not about left or right. This wasn't about conservative versus liberal, Republican versus Democrat. That this was about inclusion versus exclusion. And that it was driven by narrative, and we needed to start telling narratives. I didn't care anymore whether a person is Republican or Democrat or Libertarian. I cared that they thought opportunity was important, right? That safety was important, right? That we had values that brought us together. And when we started having conversations with people about values, right, the conversation shifted immensely. And the coalitions that we built were amazingly successful. In the Pacific Northwest, right, you all are, what this country is facing is what we faced in the 1990s. We built coalitions around the region, in rural places, in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, where you would see blue-haired punk rockers sitting next to Republican ranchers, right? We may not have had much in common, but we knew organized bigotry was not the answer to the complex problems we were facing. But stories, right, also need to be sung, they need to be written, they need to be drawn, right? And that telling our stories of a multiracial America, of inclusive society, that allowed people to grieve, that allowed people to come together on values is what led us to build this inclusive democracy project. And we brought together artists primarily in the Americana, folk, country, spoken word, right? All the folk, some punk rockers in there. And we had a conversation. We didn't talk to them about, here are the issues we think you should do or the fundraisers you should do for us, right? What we understood were these were leaders who had their own constituencies, their own fan bases who they wanted to talk to each and every day and wanted to get to know better. What we did is we listened to them, right, and helped them tell their stories better, right? And the anchor was something I learned from a folk singer by the name of Tom Paxton. It's okay if you don't know him, but he's an amazing curmudgeon too. Tom, love you. But one time I was taking a class, a music class from Tom Paxton, and the thing he said was, Eric, the secret to good songwriting is not about telling your story, but telling your story in a way that allows other people to see themselves in it. That's the society we're trying to build right now. That's the one of abundance. And that's the value that we brought into the Inclusive Democracy Project. And it's the value that every artist should carry right now. We don't need more politics. We need more stories that thread us together, that thread the values, so that we can hold together around the universal grief, right? That is both historic and present tense. Those threads, right, that hold us together and that we build now, right, are so important because the changes in the world aren't done yet, right? This is an ending of an age and a beginning of another age, and no one wants to be around in the middle of changing of ages, but yet here we are, right? And so the thing we're going to do is be excited, right? And we're going to be nervous, and we're not going to know the difference, right? But we're going to jump off that stage anyway together. And if we're threaded, that's how we know we're going to catch one another. And stories are the things that bring us together. So everyone in here is an artist. You have to find your story, the story that allows other people to see themselves. And you got to tell it over and over and over as you're doing your work of governance. Let's do this multiracial society. Why not? We've tried everything else. Let's give it a shot.
Well, so many more questions, but we have to end the evening. So I just want to thank you, Eric, for this incredible conversation. And I want to just offer everyone a moment to sort of take a breath, because it is a really ineffable, this is like literally my new favorite word. It will be used constantly now. But this ineffable moment that we've had this week, to just let that breath out and know, as it says at the exhibition, Esther and the Dream of One Loving Family, humanity should be our race, love should be our religion. And I'd like to end it there. Thank you all so much for being here.
I just want to say thank you, incredible thank you to Eric, to Cecile for an inspiring conversation. And thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate it.